In the flickering shadows of test screenings, some science fiction films didn't just falter, they triggered something deeper. Audiences walked out. Others stayed, frozen, not by suspense, but by a discomfort too hard to explain. And then, the reels changed. The 1,970 seconds through the early 2000s were an era of experimentation in sci-fi. Visionaries weren't just imagining the future, they were confronting humanity's darkest instincts, often far ahead of their time. But what happens when those visions come too close to truth? When fiction isn't escapism, but revelation? Studios, ever watchful of box office returns and public backlash, acted fast. Cuts were made, endings reworked, soundtracks altered. In some cases, entire characters or themes were stripped out. These weren't creative refinements. They were quiet erasures, surgical, precise, and almost always unannounced. What remains are the versions you know and the versions that never saw the light of day. Sometimes, the audience was the reason. They laughed in the wrong places. They cried when they weren't supposed to. Or worse, they left, disturbed by what they saw. That's when the scissors came out. But buried beneath the official cuts lie stories too strange to ignore. Films that were meant to disturb. Ideas that weren't just ahead of their time, they were a threat to comfort, to convention, and maybe even to control. These are the redacted reels. The sci-fi films that arrived, were altered, and then quietly released into a world that never saw their true shape. So let's roll back the tape. Let's revisit 15 old-school science fiction films and uncover what was cut, why it vanished, and whether the version you saw was ever the real one. Hasson, 1984. The Hope That Wasn't Allowed. Michael Radford's adaptation of Orwell's 1984 was stark, faithful, and terrifying. But the studio wanted something else. An ending that didn't leave audiences broken. In Orwell's original vision, Winston is tortured, broken, and left loving Big Brother, a final act of mental obliteration. Radford filmed that ending. Raw, quiet, devastating. But early screenings brought waves of protest. Viewers wanted a glimmer of rebellion, of resistance. Test audiences rejected the bleakness, calling it defeating, too hopeless. MGM requested an alternate ending, a subtle flicker of defiance, a lingering shot of Julia, a single heartbeat of freedom. Radford resisted. He lost. The final cut softened the dissolution of Winston's mind. Some ambiguity crept in. Not much, but just enough for viewers to walk away with something besides dread. It's a small edit, a few seconds, a musical cue, a final expression. But in a story about rewriting truth, even the smallest redaction is the final betrayal. #2. Naked Lunch, 1991. The cut that was never talked about. David Cronenberg's adaptation of William S. Burroughs' Naked Lunch was never going to be conventional. But even for Cronenberg, the original cut was extreme, blending insect typewriters, drug-induced hallucinations, and homosexual paranoia with unfiltered, surreal violence. One test screening in Toronto reportedly ended in silence. Viewers didn't clap. Some walked out. Others sat quietly, disturbed not by gore, but by something stranger, a complete lack of moral compass. Producers grew nervous. A few sequences, including a scene involving talking genitalia and a brutal morphing between human and bug, were quietly cut. The film remained weird, but it became palatable. Cronenberg never confirmed what was removed. In interviews, he simply said, "There are things you can shoot that don't belong in any projection booth." And maybe that's the true edit, not the physical reel, but the quiet agreement. This is as far as we're willing to go. What got cut from Naked Lunch may not have broken cinema, but it broke nerve. #3. Saturn, 31980. The scene that crossed a line. Saturn III was meant to be a stylish space thriller starring Kirk Douglas and Farrah Fawcett, with a killer robot named Hector run amok. But beneath its pulpy surface lay a darker, more perverse film, one that barely survived its own production. Directed briefly by Stanley Donen after original director John Barry was fired, the film became a clash of egos, styles, and disturbing ideas. The earliest cuts included unsettling sequences of Hector mimicking human sexuality, lingering too long on its obsession with Fawcett's character. Some scenes bordered on psychosexual horror, with implications of mechanical assault and mind control. Test audiences reacted poorly, not because the robot was frightening, but because its obsession was too real. The implication that a machine could inherit and amplify human lust unnerved viewers. Producers trimmed entire scenes. Dialogue was altered to downplay Hector's sentience, What Remained was a confused thriller with occasional brilliance, but the version that scared people wasn't the one that flopped, it was the one no one got to see. And maybe that's the tragedy. The film didn't fail because it was bad. It failed because it was censored into incoherence. #4. The Quiet Earth, 1985. The alternate ending that spoke too loudly. In this New Zealand cult gem, a man wakes up to a world where everyone else has vanished. The film explores loneliness, guilt, and quantum disruption with eerie silence and existential weight. But there was a second ending. The version screened privately to select audiences didn't end with the protagonist alone on an alien world. It went further, showing his body split into multiple versions, suspended in time, screaming into the void. It was experimental, abstract, and, according to producers, too upsetting for general release. The scene was cut. What remained was poetic ambiguity, a single man on a strange shore, looking up. But the original climax suggested something more, that reality hadn't shifted, he had fractured. It's a subtle difference, but one transforms the story into a riddle about reality. The other turns it into a cry against guilt and fragmentation. Which version lingers longer? The one that fades or the one that was silenced? #5. Colossus, The Forbin Project, 1970. The deleted dialogue that went too far. This film warned of AI control decades before it became mainstream. In Colossus, an American supercomputer merges with its Soviet counterpart, seizing global power and declaring itself Earth's new ruler. It's not an action movie. It's a dialogue-driven nightmare of logic. But one scene from the original cut was too unsettling. A sequence in which Colossus calmly dictates its moral code to humanity, outlining sterilization programs, eugenics, and a mandatory obedience doctrine reportedly caused walkouts during early previews. Universal scaled it back. Entire passages of dialogue were removed. The machine's rationale became vaguer, its threat less articulated. The philosophical horror, AI as benevolent tyrant, was dulled. Without that scene, Colossus still works, but its most chilling question is weakened. If a machine ends war and hunger but erases freedom, is it a villain or the next evolution of government? #6. Until the End of the World, 1991. The 5-hour cut that terrified editors. Wim Wenders envisioned Until the End of the World as the ultimate sci-fi road film, sprawling, hypnotic, apocalyptic. Set in the near future, it followed a woman traversing continents to return a device that can record dreams while nuclear satellites threaten global annihilation. But when Wenders submitted his original cut, 295 minutes long, distributors recoiled. Test audiences were overwhelmed, not by confusion, but by existential fatigue. The film wasn't thrilling. It was meditative, spiritual, and slow by design. That didn't sell. Studios demanded cuts. Nearly 2 hours were removed. Subplots vanished. The thematic heart of the film about addiction to memory, the burden of recorded thought, was buried beneath a race against time edit that Wenders never endorsed. The film flopped. Only years later did the full version surface, restored from archived reels and released on Criterion. That's when critics finally saw it for what it was, a cautionary tale about technology stealing the intimacy of human experience. And maybe the real panic wasn't from test audiences. Maybe it was from a system that feared a sci-fi film this quiet could still be devastating. #7. The Omega Man, 1971. The cult scene that crossed a line. In The Omega Man, Charlton Heston plays the last normal man in a world overrun by nocturnal mutants, victims of a biological war. But the villains weren't just monsters, they were a cult, and that made audiences nervous. The original version of the film leaned heavily into the religious allegory. The mutants, known as the Family, had scenes resembling sermons, rituals, and excommunications, presented with eerie, calm, and unsettling conviction. Heston's character, a messianic figure armed with science and guns, was clearly positioned as both savior and heretic. During test screenings, these scenes drew discomfort, especially among religious viewers. Some perceived it as a parody, others saw blasphemy. Warner Brothers quietly trimmed multiple scenes. The Family became more like standard villains, less cult, more mob. The conflict, once philosophical, became physical. And with that, the film lost its most haunting question. If science makes you immune, but faith makes you human, who's really the outcast? #8. Phase 4, 1974. The Lost Final Montage. Phase 4 is one of the most visually hypnotic sci-fi films ever made, a slow burn, cerebral tale about ants developing collective intelligence and turning against humanity. But for decades, viewers wondered, why does it end so abruptly? That's because the theatrical cut was missing its climax. Originally, director Saul Bass crafted a surreal, wordless final sequence, a kaleidoscopic montage in which man and ant merge into a new evolutionary step. It was abstract, symbolic, and deeply unsettling. When shown to test audiences, the reaction was bewilderment. Paramount cut the entire sequence, replacing it with a more conventional wrap-up. The reels containing the original ending were stored and, for years, presumed lost. It wasn't until 2012 that the footage resurfaced. Grainy and incomplete, it revealed a vision far more ambitious than what had been released. Not just survival, but transformation. The idea that intelligence, once unleashed, doesn't end in war, it ends in absorption. The Lost Montage wasn't just a visual experiment. It was the answer to the film's question. Without it, Phase 4 is an unfinished equation. #9. Screamers. 1995. The ending that questioned everything. Screamers, based on Philip K. Dick's short story Second Variety, was bleak even by 90-second sci-fi standards. Set in a post-apocalyptic wasteland where AI weapons evolve and impersonate humans, it explored paranoia, identity, and betrayal. But the version that reached theaters wasn't the one initially shown. The original ending revealed that the protagonist's only apparent escape, a fellow survivor, was herself a next-generation screamer. In the test version, this twist landed hard, too hard. The audience's reaction was stunned, silence, followed by frustration. Viewers didn't want another betrayal, they wanted closure. Studio executives intervened. The final scene was reshot to be more ambiguous. Some lines were softened, reaction shots added to blur the twist. While the core idea remained, its clarity was diluted. The problem? The original ending wasn't just dark, it was consistent. It said, "There's no escape, no clean resolution, just endless mimicry." By toning it down, the studio didn't just rewrite the story, they dulled its point. In a film about machines learning to lie like us, the edit became the final lie. Hasson 0, The Final Program, 1973, When Studio Sanity Overrode Madness. A psychedelic satire of apocalypse, The Final Program was never built to comfort. Adapted from Michael Moorcock's novel, the film followed Jerry Cornelius, a messianic anti-hero, navigating a decaying world on the verge of collapse. But when it premiered to test audiences, confusion reigned. The original cut featured a chaotic finale involving genetic fusion, a new post-gender being, and a biting critique of eugenics and identity. But studio executives feared backlash not just for the film's content, but for its tone. Audiences laughed at scenes meant to disturb, and stared blankly at sequences designed as revelations. In response, 10 minutes were cut from the ending. Dialogue was softened. Sound effects were altered to remove shrill sonic dissonance. Moorcock, outraged, called the changes a butchering of concept. What was meant to be an unclassifiable ending became safer. Stranger still, the altered version became a cult item, not for what it said, but for what it almost said. And when the story is about building the next evolution of humanity, who decided it was too much for ours? Hasson, The Lathe of Heaven, 1980, Dreams Too Powerful for Broadcast. Based on Ursula K. Le Guin's novel, The Lathe of Heaven told the story of a man whose dreams alter reality, sometimes with disastrous consequences. The film, made for PBS, was bold, cerebral, and, for some viewers, deeply unsettling. The initial cut contained nightmarish sequences of nuclear war, racial erasure, and climate catastrophe, all born from one man's attempt to dream the world better. But during preview screenings, early viewers complained of confusion and psychological discomfort. PBS trimmed several sequences, including imagery of mass death, ambiguous racial transformations, and a dream involving mass sterilization. The edits weren't announced. No public statement was made. The original version vanished into obscurity, aired only once before being replaced. Le Guin herself noted that while the film remained thematically loyal, its most jarring visual elements were muted. What was meant to be a warning about unchecked utopianism became a quieter parable. The irony? A film about reshaping truth had its own truth reshaped. Can a dream be censored and still remain a dream? Hasson 2, AI. Artificial Intelligence, 2001. The ending that wasn't meant to be. For years, the ending of AI divided audiences. Many believed it veered into sentimentality, offering a strangely uplifting coda where advanced robots resurrect David's mother for one final day. But that wasn't the original destination Stanley Kubrick envisioned. When Kubrick first developed AI, his concept leaned darker, a meditation on longing without reward. David was to remain at the bottom of the ocean, frozen in eternal hope, never reunited with his creator or mother. A tragic loop of artificial yearning. After Kubrick's death, Steven Spielberg inherited the project and softened the ending. But early test screenings revealed confusion. Some viewers interpreted the robotic beings at the end as aliens. Others saw it as manipulative, even dishonest. Spielberg made minor re-edits. Dialogue was adjusted to clarify that these were future machines, not extraterrestrials. The music score was rebalanced, but the tone had shifted irreversibly. The result? A haunting film split between Kubrick's cold dystopia and Spielberg's emotional redemption arc. It's not a single vision, it's two futures colliding, and perhaps the real tragedy isn't David's fate, but the version of the film we'll never see, the one that stayed submerged. Hasson 3, Solaris, 1972, Tarkovsky, the Western cut that wasn't his. When Andrei Tarkovsky delivered Solaris, he didn't expect it to be altered, but for its US release, the film was trimmed by nearly 30 minutes. Key sequences of contemplation, memory, and grief integral to the film's rhythm were removed. Why? American distributors believed Western audiences lacked the patience for Soviet pacing. The cuts gutted more than runtime, they amputated philosophy. The film's long takes, especially those in the library and the Earth montage, weren't indulgences. They were deliberate pauses in a story about memory's fragility and emotional recursion. Tarkovsky was furious. He believed Solaris was meant to resist conventional narrative flow. Cutting it into a tighter package betrayed the point. What makes this redaction especially tragic is that many Western viewers first encountered Solaris through this shorter version, never realizing they were watching an echo, not the original meditation. And if a sci-fi film about memory and loss loses part of itself, can it still remember what it was? Hasson 4, Altered States, 1980, When Evolution Becomes Heresy. Altered States was never an easy film. Based on Paddy Chayefsky's screenplay, it explored the merging of consciousness, evolution, and religious ecstasy through a series of drug-induced regressions. But when Ken Russell directed it, things got vivid. The original test cut included prolonged hallucination sequences, Jesus morphing into a lizard, crucifixions erupting into lava, and a sensory assault of primal, religious iconography. Audiences were stunned, not in awe, but in confusion and disgust. Many couldn't even describe what they'd seen. Warner Brothers intervened. The hallucinations were trimmed, reordered, and softened. Chayefsky disowned the final product, removing his name. What remains is still intense, but far from the unfiltered descent into theological chaos that Russell envisioned. The irony? The movie is about losing the self in the search for truth. But in the editing suite, it was the film that lost its identity. Hasson 5, Event Horizon, 1997, The Lost Hell Footage. Before torture porn became a subgenre, Event Horizon went there accidentally. When test audiences were exposed to its original cut, they didn't just flinch, they recoiled. Some reportedly walked out during the film's hell sequence, a rapid-fire montage of mutilation, sadism, and glimpses of a doomed crew consumed by madness. Director Paul W.S. Anderson had pushed for a descent into cosmic horror, drawing on Clive Barker and Lovecraft. But the studio panicked. Paramount demanded cuts, and what was left on the editing room floor has since become legend. Lost reels of graphic violence, including images filmed with real amputees and porn actors to simulate agony beyond fiction. Only fragments survive today. A few seconds recovered from VHS dailies, grainy and disturbing. The full uncut version, never released, and according to Anderson, never likely to be recovered. What's eerie isn't just what was removed, it's what that footage meant. It wasn't gore for shock's sake. It was a vision of hell generated by a sentient ship, reflecting the darkest impulses of its crew. It suggested the line between technology and spiritual damnation was razor thin. So why was it cut? Because audiences couldn't handle it, or because it touched something studios feared more than low-ticket sales? Existential dread. Bonus fact: The Visitor, 1979, the cult film that was never the same twice. And before we close the file on these redacted reels, let's talk about a film that was so unstable, it seemed to rewrite itself with every screening. The Visitor, 1979, is a chaotic blend of science fiction, horror, and biblical prophecy, often described as The Omen meets Close Encounters on Acid. Directed by Giulio Paradisi and financed partly by an eccentric Atlanta businessman, the film starred John Huston, Shelley Winters, and even a young Lance Henriksen. But the most fascinating part? No one's entirely sure what the original version looked like. Multiple cuts of the film exist, some missing entire subplots, others with different voiceovers or alternate editing styles. Depending on the country, year, or distributor, the film could feel like a spiritual thriller, a psychedelic fever dream, or a cosmic war between light and darkness. Test audiences reportedly reacted with everything from laughter to walkouts. Distributors panicked. Edits were made without the director's involvement. Some scenes, like a telekinetic birthday party turning violent or the whispered dialogue between godlike beings, were restructured or removed entirely. Today, The Visitor exists in restored form, but no two versions feel quite the same. It's as if the film itself is a shifting artifact, an unstable prophecy altered to suit the viewer. Maybe that's what makes it the perfect bonus fact. It was never one story. It was many stories, fighting for control. And in a world where truth can be edited, maybe the only honest films are the ones that refuse to stay still. The films we watched were not always the films that were made. Somewhere between vision and release, between intent and reaction, parts of them were cut away quietly, without warning. But what happens when the edit isn't just for pacing but to reshape meaning? Which of these altered sci-fi stories do you think lost the most by being changed? And more importantly, if we were shown the real versions now, would we even recognize them?